The summer of 1954 had been unusually warm in Denton County, Missouri. Days stretched long and slow, the heat hanging thick in the air like a wet curtain, and the river, the Merrimack, offered one of the few places where a person could feel alive without melting under the sun. In a modest, weathered farmhouse just a few miles outside of town, two brothers, Gerald and Tommy Maddox, were already awake before the rooster crowed. Gerald, the elder at 14, had always been the planner, the leader. Tommy, just 10, followed his big brother with a heart full of admiration and a tackle box full of hand-me-down lures. It was Saturday, July 17th. They had their day mapped out. Breakfast with their mama, then off to the riverbank where they'd caught catfish just the week before. They knew every curve of the river, every branch where the big ones hid. It was their world and no one else's. Their mother, Mary Maddox, stood barefoot at the front steps of the house, holding a chipped mug of coffee and watching them march off with poles slung over their shoulders. She smiled when Gerald turned to give her a little salute. Tommy waved so hard his tackle box nearly slipped from his hand. Mary always felt a strange kind of peace seeing her boys together, like nothing could go wrong in a world where they had each other. She watched them disappear past the oak trees that lined the dusty path toward the Merrimack. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, just a faint glow teasing the horizon. She would later recall that morning 1,000 times, replaying it like a scratched record in her mind. She'd wonder if she should have called them back, maybe for one more kiss on the cheek. But that's the cruelty of hindsight. It makes the simplest moments feel like warnings you somehow missed. By noon, Mary started glancing at the clock. The boys had said they'd be back by lunchtime. At 1 p.m., she packed a sandwich for each of them and walked the half-mile trail to the river herself. The tackle box was gone. So were the boys. All she found was a pair of footprints in the wet mud near the bend, and a single rusted hook stuck in a tree trunk. She called their names, once, twice, then screamed until her voice cracked. Nothing answered except the rustle of leaves and the soft gurgle of the river. Mary ran all the way back to the house, heart pounding, lungs burning, praying she'd find them sitting on the porch laughing. But the porch was empty, and it would stay that way. The sheriff arrived just before sundown. Sheriff Hal Denton, a heavy-set man with a badge older than most of the deputies in town, knew the Maddox family well. He had pulled Gerald out of a ditch once after the boy tried to build a go-kart from rusted scrap metal, and he taught Tommy how to skip rocks when the boy was barely tall enough to see over the riverbank. When Mary Maddox called that afternoon, her voice cracking and near breathless, he didn't ask questions. He drove straight to the river. Within an hour, the place was swarming. Deputies, neighbors, church volunteers, even local shop owners all joined in, shouting the boys' names into the trees, combing the water's edge, stomping through brush and mud and thorn. Flashlights flickered between the trees as the sun dipped behind the hills, and still no sign of Tommy or Gerald. Not a scrap of cloth, not a broken rod, not even a ripple out of place. Just the Merrimack, still and uncaring, moving the way it always had, slow, wide, and deep. By nightfall, the sheriff had called in state patrol. Bloodhounds were brought in from Jefferson County. They picked up a scent briefly at the edge of the old stone dock, but it vanished just as quickly as it came. Boats were lowered into the water, and men with long poles poked and prodded the depths until dawn. Mary stayed on the porch all night, lantern flickering beside her, praying aloud like the words alone could drag her boys back from wherever they'd gone. The next day brought reporters. News vans from St. Louis and even one from Kansas City parked along the gravel road. Cameras rolled as Mary, with tear-streaked cheeks and wild hair, held up a picture of the boys and begged for them to come home. "They know the river," she said, her voice breaking. "They fish it every weekend. They know better than to go in too deep." But the river didn't care. It never does. As days turned to weeks, the story began to fade from the front page. Reporters packed up. The search crews dwindled. Summer wore on. Eventually, the sheriff called it. The boys were presumed drowned. They must have gone in too far, lost their footing, got pulled into a deep spot, he said. But even then, there was no peace in the explanation. Tommy had been afraid of swimming. Gerald was a strong boy, the type to pull his brother to safety if something had gone wrong. And why no gear? No tackle box, no poles, no shoes? That's what bothered Mary the most. Not a single item floated to shore, like they'd just been erased. Some locals whispered darker ideas. A stranger had been seen camping downriver earlier that week. A drifter, thin and pale, who bought canned beans and a hunting knife from the corner store and never came back. Others said the boys had run away, though no one who knew them believed that. They were kids, good kids. They loved their mother. They loved that river. But something or someone had taken them away. And whatever it was, it left nothing behind. Mary Maddox refused to believe the river had taken her boys without a trace. For years, she continued searching on her own, marking every July 19th by walking the same trail they had taken, wearing the same faded dress from that day, and bringing the same picnic basket she once packed for their lunch. Sometimes she'd sit by the river for hours, whispering into the wind as if the trees or the water might answer back. Gerald's room remained untouched. His fishing trophies lined up on the dresser, his comic books neatly stacked, a pair of socks still in the laundry basket. Tommy's tackle box, the spare one he kept in the shed, sat closed beneath the workbench, still smelling faintly of bait and rust. Mary never moved it. She couldn't. Her husband, Alan Maddox, had died of pneumonia the year before the boys disappeared. And now, the weight of loss sat like lead on her chest. Alone in the house, Mary lived in a loop, waiting for knocks that never came, for footsteps that never returned. But Denton County didn't wait. The world spun forward without mercy. New families moved in. Old neighbors moved out. The sheriff retired in 1962. The river, ever indifferent, continued its slow journey south. Mary aged into a local legend. The River Mother, they called her. Children told each other stories about the crazy woman by the trees, still waiting for her ghost sons. Some even dared one another to run up and touch her porch, like she was some witch from an old folk tale. But the truth was quieter, sadder. Mary wasn't crazy. She was grieving, and the silence of unanswered questions is often louder than any scream. Every year, she filed a report with the sheriff's office, asking for the case to be reopened. Every year, the file was pulled out, glanced at, then tucked away again. "There's just nothing more we can do," the new sheriff once told her. "I'm sorry," but the words rang hollow. Mary knew something had been missed. Whether by chance, incompetence, or a shadow no one wanted to name, her boys hadn't drowned. They had vanished, and rivers don't keep everything. Eventually, she believed they would give up their secret. That belief turned into obsession. In 1971, Mary wrote letters to journalists, to psychics, to senators. She mailed copies of her son's photos with handwritten notes, hoping someone, anyone, would look again. A few reporters came back. One even wrote a piece in a national magazine titled, "The River That Took Two Sons." It sparked new interest for a brief moment. People came. They looked. Nothing new was found. But Mary refused to stop. Every time the river level dropped after a storm, she was there with a stick, poking at logs and dragging along the banks. She memorized the currents, mapped the changes in sediment. By now, no one in Denton County really paid attention. "Poor Mary," they'd say, "still down by the water." But what they didn't know was that Mary had seen something strange 2 years earlier. A hunk of metal poking through the mud after a flood surge. It vanished a day later when the waters rose. She told the sheriff. He didn't act. But she never forgot. In the spring of 1979, the Merrimack River flooded again, as it often did after heavy rains swept across Missouri. Water levels rose quickly, turning dirt trails into muddy channels and submerging anything close to the banks. Logs floated like dead bodies, branches snapped in the current, and whole chunks of riverbank eroded overnight. But after the water receded, something strange remained. It was first spotted by a young couple hiking near the area where Gerald and Tommy had last been seen. The man, a local mechanic named Roger Haynes, noticed a curved, rusted piece of metal sticking out of the soil about 30 feet from the water's edge. At first, he thought it was just debris, an old pipe or a car part. But when he stepped closer, he realized it had been buried deep in the ground, and the earth around it looked disturbed. He and his girlfriend pulled on it for a few minutes before realizing it was part of something larger, something locked in place by decades of sediment and roots. Roger returned the next day with a friend and a pair of shovels. For hours they dug, slowly revealing a collapsed, rusted-out structure that looked like it had been underwater for a long time. It resembled the crushed frame of a metal crate or trap, about the size of a small bathtub, tightly wrapped in weeds and coated with black river silt. Inside, among the tangled mess, they saw something that stopped them cold. An old boot, small, child-sized. They stopped digging. Roger drove straight to the sheriff's office, still dirty and out of breath. By that evening, the site was cordoned off with yellow tape. Forensics experts were called in from St. Louis. And just like that, after 25 years, the river had finally given something back. The remains were buried beneath 2 feet of soil and tree roots. As the forensic team excavated the site, they uncovered what appeared to be the remnants of a crude shelter or trap. Twisted chicken wire, rusted nails, and slabs of old wood nailed together. Inside it were 2 sets of children's bones, mostly intact, resting side by side. Along with them, they found 2 decaying shoes, fragments of flannel fabric, and a small, dented metal thermos. But it was what they found next that changed everything. Deep in the corner of the structure, lodged beneath a rotted board, was a rusted green tackle box. The initials TM were still faintly visible, scratched into the lid. Tommy Maddox. The box had sat beneath the surface for over 2 decades, sealed away from time. Inside were faded fishing lures, 1 broken reel, and a folded, water-stained picture of the boys standing with their mother, smiling, arms around each other, the Merrimack River behind them. The discovery made national news. Reporters flooded Denton County. Microphones returned to Mary's porch, though she was now thinner, grayer, quieter. She didn't cry when they told her. She just nodded, as if she'd known all along. "The river never lies," she whispered. But even with the remains found, there were questions, hard questions. How had the boys ended up sealed in a makeshift trap? Who had put them there? Why had no one noticed for 25 years? The medical examiner confirmed both boys had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, but their exact time of death was unclear. There were no witnesses, no suspects. The case was reopened, but few leads remained. The river had given up its secret partially. The rest would remain buried in silence, unless someone remembered what they saw or did. The town reacted in waves: shock, horror, then whispers. The idea that someone had built a crude trap deep in the woods and hidden 2 children inside it was too much for many to process. Especially because, by 1979, most people who remembered Tommy and Gerald as living, breathing boys were older themselves, with kids and even grandkids of their own. The idea that the boys had drowned was one thing: accidental, tragic, understandable in a cruel way. But to realize that someone had harmed them, then carefully buried their bodies so close to the same riverbank people walked by every day for years, that was another thing entirely. Suspicion turned inward. Old rumors came back. People who were just names in the background became shadows. Every man who ever fished alone near that river. Every camper. Every neighbor who'd once said the boys had probably run away. Some locals even began accusing each other outright. Sheriff McClendon, who had only been a young deputy when the boys vanished, led the new investigation with quiet desperation. The evidence was minimal: just bones, a tackle box, and a makeshift structure. No fingerprints. No DNA that could be traced in those days. But something else turned up. An old, faded map of the river area, recovered from the archives during a routine review, showed a footpath that once led behind the Maddox house. A shortcut to the bend in the river where the trap had been found. It hadn't appeared on newer maps because the path had long been overgrown, erased by time and neglect. But back in the 1950s, it would have allowed someone to get from the main road to the river without being seen. It was the kind of path only a local would know. Someone who'd walked those woods. Someone who might have waited there. Mary Maddox remained at the center of it all. Her house, once silent, became a place reporters camped out day and night. People sent her letters, hundreds of them. Some expressed sorrow, others shared stories of similar losses. But one letter, handwritten in strange, slanted cursive, arrived without a return address, folded inside a plain envelope. It said only this: "They didn't scream." No signature, no explanation, just those 3 words. Mary showed it to the sheriff immediately. The letter was dusted for prints, scanned, and stored. Nothing ever came of it. But it haunted her. The idea that someone had seen what happened or had done it, and had waited 25 years to say anything, even that little. The letter was filed as part of the reopened case, labeled Exhibit A. To this day, it's the only clue ever linked directly to the unknown person responsible for what happened that morning in 1954. The sheriff followed every lead. They interviewed anyone still alive who had lived near the Maddox family. Some were cooperative. Others were bitter. One man, who had once been a teenage neighbor, claimed he saw a strange car parked near the river path that morning. The kind of car he didn't recognize, dark and low to the ground, not local. But he had no license plate, no exact color, no proof. Another woman, who had taught Sunday school at the time, recalled seeing an unfamiliar man standing outside the church weeks before the disappearance, just watching the kids. But her memory was vague, and it was decades too late to verify. Everything was too cold, too faded. The truth had vanished, buried like the boys. And the river, even though it had given something back, still kept its silence. Over the next year, the case remained open but stagnant. News outlets moved on. Reporters stopped calling. And Mary, though finally in possession of her son's remains, found no closure. She buried Gerald and Tommy side by side beneath a pair of oak trees just beyond the edge of her property, close enough to the river that she could still hear it on quiet nights. The funeral was small, mostly older locals and a few former search volunteers. There were no arrests, no justice, only the dull ache of confirmation, the weight of mystery made heavier by time. Mary placed the old photo they had found in the tackle box, the one with her smiling between her 2 boys, inside the casket, wrapped in a hand-sewn handkerchief. The same one she had tucked into Gerald's back pocket every time he left the house. "So you don't forget your way home," she used to say. It was all she could give them now. As months passed, Mary began to decline. Her hair thinned. Her hands shook. She stopped writing letters. She stopped waiting on the porch. Her eyes no longer scanned the horizon when the sun came up. One evening, her neighbor found her sitting motionless in her rocking chair, the lantern at her side still flickering, her lips moving as if in prayer. She had lost so much already that her absence, when it came, felt like the final piece of a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. Mary passed away in her sleep in November of 1980, just over a year after her sons were found. Her obituary was short, but her story, the truth of it, outlived her. People still whispered about the letter, about the strange man in the woods, about the silence from the sheriff's office after her death, and about how the river, always the river, seemed to know more than it let on. Then, in the spring of 1981, something happened that cracked open the case once more. During a controlled burn near the woods behind the old Maddox property, a local fire crew stumbled across a series of glass jars buried beneath a pile of rocks, sealed with wax and wrapped in fabric. Inside each jar was a slip of paper, some with writing, others with symbols. One note simply read, "I watched them." Another had only numbers, coordinates that led nowhere obvious. But the last jar, the one found deepest beneath the earth, contained a single child's marble blue, cloudy, worn smooth. Tommy had carried one just like it everywhere. Mary had mentioned it in interviews, in letters, even once in her Sunday testimony at church. "He never left without it," she said. Called it his river eye. That marble was never found, until now. The jars were sent to the authorities, and for a few brief weeks it seemed like real answers might finally come. But once again the trail went cold. No fingerprints, no DNA, no explanation. The symbols weren't in any known alphabet, and the coordinates led to a bend in the river long since eroded. Still, those who had grown up hearing the Maddox story began to look differently at the woods, at the quiet men who still fished alone, at the properties passed down through families, with sheds no one ever entered and basements that hadn't been unlocked in decades. Fear returned to Denton County, not because of what had happened, but because of what might still be out there. Watching, waiting, knowing. In 1983, nearly 30 years after the boys vanished, a retired game warden named Clyde Mercer came forward with a statement that sent ripples through the county once again. He had kept it to himself all those years, not out of malice, he claimed, but out of fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of what it would mean if he was right. Mercer said that in the summer of 1954, just a few days after the Maddox boys disappeared, he had been patrolling a narrow tributary that fed into the Merrimack. It was a quiet spot, almost forgotten, used mostly by trappers and old river folk who didn't want company. He remembered coming across a parked vehicle deep in the woods. One that didn't belong there. It was a dark green Dodge pickup, late 40s model, dusty and dented, but with a military decal on the back window. Mercer said he heard something that day, too. Something like metal scraping, then a sharp cry cut off quickly. He didn't investigate. He figured it was just a trapper dealing with a catch. But it stayed with him, ate at him for years. And when he heard about the marble in the jar, he couldn't sleep anymore. Authorities looked into Mercer's account. They found no records of the truck. No links to any local military personnel who drove such a vehicle. The only known Dodge of that type had been registered to a man named Ellis Rourke, a World War II veteran who had lived alone in a shack 30 miles upriver. Rourke had died in 1972. No family, no children. But when investigators searched what remained of his property, they found a rusted car door buried beneath junk in the shed, with what looked like dried blood flakes still clinging to the inside. Too degraded to test, but enough to reopen the wound. Rourke had no known connection to the Maddox family, and his criminal record was clean. Still, the coincidences stacked up like stones. Some in Denton County began calling him the River Phantom. Others weren't convinced. But one thing was certain: if he had been involved, the truth was buried with him. Then came another strange break. A box of belongings from Rourke's estate, left untouched in a county storage unit for years, was finally opened. Inside were several journals, mostly filled with ramblings about river spirits and watchers in the trees. But one entry stood out. It was dated July 16, 1954, the night before the boys went missing. It read, "The whispers were louder tonight. Said I'd see the boys again. 2 shadows, just like before. That was all. No names, no mention of Tommy or Gerald. But the timing was eerie, and the language, cryptic as it was, shook investigators. Was it the madness of an old man lost in delusion? Or was it something darker? A veiled confession from someone who believed he wasn't working alone? Local folklore began to twist with the facts. Old stories of river watchers and strange disappearances were pulled from family journals, passed down in quiet conversations and campfire tales. People started connecting dots that may never have belonged together. Children who'd gone missing decades before, rumors of fishermen seeing figures move in the woods at night, the river pulling back its edge after storms to reveal things that weren't supposed to be there. Whatever the truth was, one thing became clear. The story of Tommy and Gerald Maddox wasn't just a tragedy. It was a wound, still bleeding into the soil of Denton County, refusing to heal. In 1985, a newly formed group of volunteer cold case investigators called Echo Unit, made up of retired law enforcement, journalists, and local historians, took interest in the Maddox case. Led by a former FBI profiler named Dana Keel, the team reviewed all available records, photos, interviews, and forensics with fresh eyes. Dana was in her late 50s, sharp-minded and driven by the haunting similarities between this case and others from nearby counties. She believed the deaths of Gerald and Tommy weren't isolated. In fact, she proposed that the boys were just 2 among several children who had gone missing within 60 miles of the Merrimack between 1949 and 1962. Most of those cases had gone cold or been dismissed as runaways. But Dana noticed disturbing patterns, proximity to river systems, lack of remains, and in some cases, the presence of handmade traps or shelters found years later in remote woods. No one had ever connected them. Until now. Echo Unit published a confidential internal report they titled The Watcher Trail. It outlined 8 disappearances, including the Maddox case, where key similarities lined up. Pairs of siblings, always boys, all near water, all during summer months, and all within reach of areas controlled by old river paths and logging trails no longer in use. The report also referenced the strange glass jars found near the Maddox property, suggesting they were not unique. In 2 other cases, strange objects were recovered long after the children vanished. A broken pocketknife found in a knotted bag hanging from a tree, and in another, a handmade rag doll buried in a coffee can with a drawing of 2 children crossing a river, both with no eyes. These artifacts had been dismissed at the time, but Dana argued they were ritualistic, trophies left behind not by someone impulsive, but by someone methodical. Someone who believed what they were doing had meaning. Their investigation faced resistance. The Denton County Sheriff's Office refused to release certain files, citing ongoing case sensitivity. Even though decades had passed, something or someone was keeping parts of the truth locked away. A member of Echo Unit filed a public records request, only to find that some documents from the 1954 investigation had gone missing. Entire interview transcripts were unaccounted for. Photos of the original search site had vanished from the evidence room. Worse still, one of the volunteers working with Echo Unit claimed he was followed on multiple occasions. Once by a pickup truck with no plates, another time by a man in a black raincoat standing outside his apartment in the middle of the night. No one ever caught a name, and local police chalked it up to paranoia. But the mood shifted. What had once been a volunteer passion project began to feel dangerous. By late 1986, Echo Unit disbanded. Dana Keel retired for good, citing health concerns, in a letter that offered no further explanation. The group's final note, left quietly online in a forgotten corner of a public archive, read simply, "We tried. The trail goes deeper than we could go." For many in Denton County, the closure of Echo Unit marked the end of serious hope that the truth would ever be fully revealed. The Maddox boys had been found, yes, but their story remained more question than answer. And for those who believed the river still had more to say, the fear was not just of what had already happened. It was that something or someone had never truly left. In the early spring of 1991, nearly 40 years after the Maddox boys disappeared, an unusually dry season caused the Merrimack River to shrink back farther than anyone had seen in decades. What emerged from the receded shoreline was a graveyard of forgotten things. Bicycle frames, broken glass, rusted tools. But among the debris, a county maintenance worker discovered something that reignited everything. Lodged in the base of a sycamore tree, partially swallowed by roots, was a tin lunchbox. Inside were 2 rotted cloth napkins, a melted chocolate bar wrapper, and an old note folded into quarters, still legible despite water stains. It read, "He said it's our turn now. Don't tell Mama." The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably childlike. Forensics confirmed the ink had aged in a way consistent with decades-old material, and the paper itself was a style manufactured during the early 1950s. When compared to schoolwork still stored in the archives from Tommy Maddox's 4th-grade classroom, the match was too close to ignore. The note sent a tremor through the community. If real, it meant the boys hadn't just been lured. They may have gone willingly, or at least without fully understanding the danger. Who was he? Why would they agree to go? And what kind of person could manipulate 2 innocent boys into such a trap? Rumors surged again. A few townspeople insisted there was once a man who worked as a temporary school janitor the year the boys vanished. A man who was never officially on payroll, never appeared in any records, but who had been seen talking with children after hours. The local historical society began digging through photographs from community events in 1954. In one faded image from a summer church picnic, someone noticed a tall man in the background, standing apart from the crowd, facing the camera but with eyes obscured by shadow. No one could name him. No one remembered him. And when the photo was enhanced, a detail emerged. He was wearing what looked like an old army jacket, with a faint patch on the arm. It resembled the same military insignia found on the truck described by the retired game warden years earlier. Still, there was no identity, no arrest, just a growing sense that something had always been wrong just beneath the surface. In the woods, in the river, in the town. People began telling stories again. about things their grandparents had warned them about a figure who whistled through the trees at dusk, about strange songs heard near the riverbank late at night, about children waking up with wet footprints at the edge of their beds. Folklore and fact blurred into one unsettling truth. Someone had stalked that town in 1954, and someone may have done it again in 1956 and 1961, but no pattern was ever officially confirmed. The files remained sealed. Denton County's new sheriff, who had inherited the post after 2 previous retirements, refused to speak on the matter. "It's history," he said once during an interview. "Let the river keep what's left." But the river had never been silent, only ignored. And now, with decades of whispers echoing louder, people began to wonder if the river was done keeping secrets, or if it was just beginning to reveal how many it truly held. Today, the Maddox story remains one of the most chilling and unresolved chapters in Missouri's history. Tourists sometimes visit the old stretch of river, where a modest wooden sign now stands near the tree line, in memory of Gerald and Tommy Maddox, lost but never forgotten. Beneath that tree, the ground is quiet, peaceful almost, but for those who know the history, the silence feels heavier than it should. Local guides won't take visitors there after dark. Old-timers in Denton County still speak of shadows in the trees, of that awful summer when the boys vanished, and how their mother used to light a lantern each night, hoping they'd find their way home. The shack that once belonged to Ellis Rourke has long since collapsed, eaten away by moss and rot. But some say the ground around it still smells of iron after rain. And on certain nights, when the wind is low and the frogs fall silent, it's said you can hear 2 boys laughing, followed by the faint sound of something heavy being dragged through leaves. The file on the Maddox brothers remains technically open, though no new leads have been submitted since the early 2000s. In 2009, a local true crime podcast tried to revive interest in the case. It featured audio interviews with surviving members of Echo Unit, as well as newly digitized police dispatch recordings from the original search. But the show ended after just 3 episodes. The host cited unusual pressure from unnamed sources, and the site hosting the episodes was taken offline within weeks. Copies were passed around quietly on USB drives, but much of the original material is now missing, lost to broken links and unexplained takedowns. Still, younger generations continue to ask questions. In school projects, in message boards, in private forums titled things like "The Riverman Lives" and "Children of the Merrimack." What they'll find, if anything, remains to be seen. What we do know is this: 2 boys walked toward the river on a bright July morning in 1954, excited to fish, unaware that the trees ahead would never let them leave. And though it took 25 years for the river to return their bones, it has yet to give us the name of the person or people who took them. Some say it was a drifter. Others say a local. A few whisper it wasn't human at all. But what makes the Maddox case so haunting is not just the violence or the mystery. It's the waiting. The way a mother waited every day, every year, for the impossible. And the way the river, slow and ancient, held its silence longer than any man could. So if you ever find yourself near Denton County, and you hear the wind shift near the water, listen closely. Not for screams, but for laughter. Because sometimes what vanishes doesn't stay gone. It lingers, and the river remembers. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, consider sharing it. Because sometimes, the silence around a case is what lets it stay forgotten. Subscribe for more real stories like this one. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.